Science, Politics, and Gnosticism by Eric Voegelin, a short work which offers an interesting perspective on the nature of certain mass intellectual slash political movements. So, if you are unfamiliar with the name, Eric Voegelin was a German American political philosopher of the 20th century who is notable for advancing the theory that certain mass intellectual slash political movements, such as Comtean positivism, Hegelianism, Marxism, Nazism, etc., are actually Gnostic in nature. Now, it perhaps should be iterated up front that when Voegelin applies the word Gnostic to these movements, he isn't necessarily asserting that these movements are actually like religiously Gnostic. Rather, just that Gnosticism is kind of a philosophical framework, a lens through which the world is viewed by these people who comprise these movements, even if not consciously so. So, Gnosticism historically has been kind of labeled typically a Christian heresy, but as Voegelin himself kind of touches on in the book, this may not actually be an accurate designation. In fact, it may be that Gnosticism is actually older than just an offshoot of Christianity, and that it was actually just folded into Christianity once Christianity came along. But nevertheless, Gnosticism has, again, historically been largely considered to be an offshoot of a heresy of Christianity, and it is important to contrast the worldviews between these two belief systems in order to kind of understand Voegelin's thesis with this work. So the typical Christian conception of life and the world is that the universe is governed by a God which is ultimately good, and man is a flawed creature which must change his ways for the better and constantly pursue a higher ideal, which is usually represented by God or Christ. But contrarily, Gnosticism posits that man is basically good and that it is the world, rather, which is evil. That the world is a prison, more or less, which was created by an evil false god known as the Demiurge or Yaldabaoth, which imprisoned man within it, and that man has the power to transcend and overcome this illusory, deceptive, and ultimately evil world through the proper knowledge or gnosis. Now, this distinction is kind of the key to understanding Voegelin's argument with this book, because what he asserts in Science, Politics, and Gnosticism is that a lot of these mass intellectual slash political movements actually follow a Gnostic pattern, that they propose that the world as it is broken and evil, but that man really isn't, and that with the proper knowledge we can overcome the world and what Voegelin would call immanentize the eschaton and create a better world, a paradisical world, if you will, here on Earth. Now, we can see this, Voegelin says, in such movements as like Comtean positivism, and this definitely is pretty blatant in that movement, because Auguste Comte, if I'm pronouncing that name right, was actively trying to formulate a conscious religious movement that would eventually, he hoped, supplant other religions such as Christianity and Islam and Judaism, and ultimately conquer the world and bring about a, like, again, kind of utopian world governed by the principles of positivism as formulated by Auguste Comte. So that one's pretty like low-hanging fruit, I would say. But Voegelin goes on to apply the same kind of scrutiny to movements such as Hegelianism, because Hegel's philosophy, actually, I don't know that you can actually really call what Hegel did philosophy. Rather, it would be much more accurate to call it what it is, which is a form of theology, a very twisted and historically detrimental, I would say, theology, where history is a process, a teleological process of the absolute spirit or God in Hegelian terms, realizing itself through a dialectical process. That is, that history unfolds according to a rational process, and that ultimately that is leading towards something, a kind of end of history, if you will. Again, a better world, perhaps once the dialectical process has been fully realized. But then also, we can view Marxism through this lens. And this one is, again, I think this one fits pretty well with Voegelin's thesis because Marxism as a doctrine is so far reaching, so all encompassing, that it as well is really more of a theology, if you will, because once again, like Hegelianism, which Marxism is an adaptation of, history is teleological. It unfolds according to a fixed and rational process. We have the prophet figure in the person of Karl Marx, who figured out the course of history, allegedly. And then we also have like saint figures such as Lenin and Shea, right? And then we also have the coming utopia, once all people have been awoken from their false consciousness to their true communistic nature, right? And then we will realize the end of history, and everybody will live happily ever after singing Kumbaya, and without the pitfalls of private property, right? So again, that fits pretty well, I think, with Voegelin's argument here, because once more, Marxism is really, like, in truth, something of a theology, a kind of atheistic theology, if you will. But then we also can apply Voegelin's argument to Nazism, because Nazism was also a movement which had mystical overtones and also promised a kind of end of history, if you will. That is, we can see Hitler as kind of the prophet figure, the leader, who formulated a doctrine involving racial mysticism and Aryan supermen, a chosen people group, if you will, who were chosen, if not by God, then at least by nature, to inherit the world, right? So, like, we can see when we view these mass intellectual / political movements through Voegelin's lens of Gnosticism, we can see that there is like an element of religion to these things, if not explicitly, then at least implicitly. And this is a very interesting work because it brings the fact into relief, you might say, that the line between religion and politics is often very, very blurry. Now, as to like criticisms of this, because this is a work which is not without its critics, some might say that Voegelin's thesis is so malleable that it can basically just be stretched and applied to anything that Eric Voegelin probably did not like, such as communism and Nazism, etc. That you can just kind of lump all these movements into a heretical mindset, right? And, you know, I think there may be something to be said for that. But as for me, I did find this book to be highly stimulating, if nothing else, because once again, it does kind of bring into greater relief the fact that religion and politics are often very, very similar to each other. In fact, it might well be stated that it is only comparatively recently that separation of church and state has, you know, become a thing. Like, for the longest time, religion and politics really did go hand in hand. And so I don't think it would be remiss to point out the fact that a lot of these mass movements, especially in light of the often fanatical devotion that they engender, can be likened to ersatz religions. In fact, that's the title of one of the essays in this book is Ersatz religion, how these movements, even though they don't really involve explicit like supernaturalism or deities, they nonetheless provide, again, a kind of framework, a lens through which reality can be viewed, which is, for lack of a better word, religious in nature. And Eric Voegelin would say Gnostic in nature. So that is kind of the overview of the book. It's basically propounding this thesis that Gnosticism, not necessarily in a consciously, explicitly religious meaning, but kind of denoting kind of a framework, an ideological lens, is responsible for many of the mass intellectual / political movements throughout history, and still into the current day. And, I do find once more his arguments quite intriguing, if nothing else, because it does, again, bring into focus the fact that religion and politics are often very similar and often kind of do the same things, if you know what I mean. But yeah, in keeping with my normal reviews of non-fictional philosophical works such as this, I won't grade this book, but I will say that I found it very stimulating, very thought-provoking, and it really does provide a perspective on certain movements throughout history and again into the current day, which I think does have the potential to explain a lot. So it was worth it to read this for me, and also it's very brief. It's only like 78 pages, so you can read this in a day, and you might get a lot of good out of it. So yes, Science, Politics, and Gnosticism by Eric Voegelin. Have you read this work? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said about it here today. And if you haven't read Science, Politics, and Gnosticism, like I said, you might want to pick this up because it will give you something to chew on, and it may make you look at certain things, certain movements, certain events, and actions in a different light, I think. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.